right. So you spent years at Cheddar, then you went to CuriosityStream, and then you went up at a newsletter company. Talk to me a little bit about that progression and why ultimately, after all of that aggressive like streaming and like daily business media, live video media, you decided to jump over to what, at the time really was still a newsletter company, even though we thought we were more than that.
Good question. So I have spent most of my time correctly in video, in TV, film, streaming, kind of that world, but different iterations of it over the course of my career, from VOD platforms, streaming video on demand, actual television, all that sort of stuff. So I've always moved to where I think the most interesting things in the industry are happening. Funny enough, for Morning Brew, recruiters had reached out to me a couple times over the years. And each time I had said, I'm not really interested in that because I had done Cheddar. And in my initial impression of what Morning Brew was doing, it wasn't doing the exact same thing as Cheddar, but to me, it did feel like it was similar enough where I didn't want to go, sitting at CuriosityStream in the streaming video space. I didn't want to go and do something that felt very similar or similar enough to building Cheddar again, the daily business product. After another just decline on really being interested in Morning Brew, I got a call from the person that I reported to at Cheddar, Eric Harris. And he was like, hey, man, I know that you were saying that you weren't necessarily interested in Morning Brew, but I just had a conversation with Austin, and I think you're wrong. I think you have the wrong impression of what they're trying to do. It's like, that's interesting. At that time, I had been at CuriosityStream for a few years. I was living in two cities, so I was on the Acela every week. So I was living Monday through Thursday down in DC, and then Thursday through Sunday up in this area, which is kind of fun in a little way, but it's also very taxing. And so in talking with Austin after Eric told me I had to do that, I realized that the ambitions of what Morning Brew wanted to be did not match my impression of what Morning Brew was at that moment. And, a lot of my focus has been for a long time and remains to be the way that, call it the creator economy, is shifting the entire way that the media industry works and operates. And so in talking with Austin about how they wanted Morning Brew to be able to participate and grow and even shift and change in some ways the way that media companies and the creator economy interacted with each other, sounded very interesting. And, I was looking at the investments that the company had made into multimedia so far, and, the returns and a lot of the not returns that they had seen, but also the ambitions. And it seemed clear to me that there was, a very solid path for the company, but with a different strategy to be able to build into platforms, audio, video creators. And so my impression of what that role was going to be changed very, significantly in those conversations. And it ended up being something that was, not just not the exact same as Cheddar, but actually a really solid continuation of what I had been working on.
So a lot of media companies, especially text-based ones, newsletter ones, they've all tried to do multimedia. I mean, there's a Wikipedia page about the pivot to video. Like, this is not a new thing. What was it about what Austin presented to you, and what was it about what Morning Brew's early investments had shown that made you go, actually, there is something here? Because, I was there before you, and Hard Early Work didn't actually work. It wasn't really doing what we thought it was going to do. So what did you see that actually made you go, I see something there?
I saw opportunity, and I saw a desire from the company to get it right. To be very honest with you, like most, if not all, of what was being done before is no longer happening. So I didn't see a whole lot that was happening and then think, all right, this is so close, we need to adjust it a little bit.
Pull that thread. What was happening?
In terms of what was being produced, there were podcasts, there were videos, most of it felt very pivot to video-y. Most of it felt very kind of cookie cutter. It didn't feel like it took the soul of why people loved the Morning Brew newsletter and other products and then turned that into native expressions of those brands across platforms. But there are a lot of talented people who are working on it, but in a structure and a system that, I felt didn't really let them sing in the way that they could. And I saw at the high levels an understanding of that and a desire to get to that. So it wasn't, an exact, we can iterate this into success, but it was the components are here to, blow up the strategy, and, in some ways unleash the creative powers that did exist within the company to be able to build something that was going to work.
All right. So when you joined, we had this state of multimedia, a lot of just doing things. as I think back on the history of it, sort of doing things because we had to do things, creating video just because we knew we had to create video. You join. What were the changes that had to be made both on multimedia, but then on the revenue strategy side to actually monetize that video? Because we never could make any money on it in an actual margin on what we were doing.
Totally. So the unfortunate and sad answer is my second day, I had to cut half the team on the multimedia side. And that was absolutely a necessity because the investment was just not matching where the ROI was or could be in the near future. And again, it was one of those things where, had to cut people that probably could have done great work in another structure. It's just we were too far away at that time. So there was a right sizing of the team investment and resourcing that went into it to be able to give us the time and the paths to be able to grow, I think, a more solid foundation. One of my first big projects was Morning Brew Daily. We launched that a few months after I got there. That was the first thing that I really, sunk my teeth into launching. And that was, we used the feed of the previous podcast, Business Casual, that Morning Brew had been running for a while, but had, plateaued and wasn't really growing. And we turned it into, as I was saying before, kind of what is the soul of the Morning Brew newsletter, but in podcast form, not a reading of the newsletter. That was something I was very clear on. I didn't want it to be, an audio version of the newsletter in any way, but why do people love the newsletter? And if their media diet has them actually wanting that sort of thing in podcast form, what would that look like? So we did a ton of casting and screen testing work on that. We ended up finding Neil, who is the executive editor of the Morning Brew newsletter, and then Toby, who is a boomerang, who had left. He was doing a lot of social work, brought him back to do social and to host, and it worked out really well. And similar to Morning Brew Daily, like from there also did a bunch of other expansion work. So we launched good work with Dan Toomey. Dan Toomey had been there making Morning Brew video, but we gave him his own franchise. We shifted how all of the video teams were thinking about creating content away from being, again, like kind of more cookie cutter digital media company into more of like the ethos of Morning Brew. And we're making all of that progress. I will say the success that we had in terms of turning around the audience trajectory and really growing very quickly in terms of audience and audience engagement absolutely outpaced our ability to monetize a lot of this stuff. And the reason for that is when you are a newsletter-focused company, all of your muscle memory is going to be built around selling newsletters, which makes a lot of sense. And so when you have something like Morning Brew Daily, it took a little while, but it's not that far off from selling a newsletter. You're selling an ad spot by day that kind of, can be, we judge them up, but they're ad reads. Mm-hmm. And so that did take a little bit of time just for people to get comfortable with audio as a medium, but did start chugging along and it is monetizing very well right now. Creator content and video content is very different than selling newsletters. And so we have made tremendous progress over the past year, I would say, and 2 years, but like really in the last year, but there's still work that we need to do so that our revenue teams understand more kind of intrinsically and intuitively the differences of how all of these products work, and that they have the support systems and infrastructure so that it doesn't take them, 5 times longer to sell a video product than it would a newsletter product, because then naturally, of course, they're going to find the path of, least resistance, but also the path to get, the money that we're asking them to get. And if we don't intentionally build infrastructure around them so that that doesn't just become default to newsletter, default to podcast, then of course the video products are going to be harder to sell. So we've been experimenting with things like recently we brought in our first dedicated creator and video seller who's working directly with those teams and with a sales team to kind of be an in-between of tackling that inventory specifically, and some other initiatives and a lot of training so that, again, our sales team just gets more and more comfortable and is able to maximize their own value in selling the video inventory that we have, which is a premium video.
But can we talk a little bit about how you package that video? Because again, and this is the luxury of having worked there. I remember the time when everything was very custom. Everything was very, we're going to do this video thing. We're going to do that event, custom event. Everything was very custom, but you're talking about audience. You're talking about building these shows that are not so cookie cutter, but are also much more focused to the soul. So how did that custom to non-custom rev strategy have to change to make it so that the thing actually made money?
Totally. So we changed that system basically. So what you're talking about is the previous iteration of what I think we called the creative studio would create branded content, but it would be very divorced from the editorial brand. It wouldn't be the same people making it for the most part. It would kind of be just based on a video that the brand would want. And it felt a lot more like work for hire than branded content. And so the shift was, as we were building these high engagement, audience heavy brands, the branded content that we're making is the same editorial teams creating that branded content. Obviously, that injects its own complexity. But what the goal of that is that the branded content has to meet in the center of the Venn diagram between the brand message that the brand wants and the editorial voice that we have. If it doesn't fit both those things, either someone's going to be unhappy or we're just not going to be able to execute on it. But almost always you can find that center of the Venn diagram. So instead of a video coming out from Morning Brew or Good Work or Maxonomics that felt very much just like a work for hire coming from those handles, it feels very much like the editorial brand creating either custom branded or branded editorial videos that are in partnership with that brand.
All right. So we're going to dive way deeper into the various components of the business, including more on multimedia. But I was at Morning Brew for 3 years, and I think about my 3 years in two chunks. The first year and a half, nothing could go wrong. Not a thing could go wrong. We were making money. We were growing. We all thought we were the greatest operators on the planet. Second half of that year and a half, not quite so great. You joined in the first 6 months of that second half of my 3-year period there. Talk to me about what you saw for the company, because you said your second day were layoffs, right? So we made our first big cut. We made a second cut in the beginning of 2023. Talk about what the landscape of Morning Brew looked like, and what were all the changes that had to be made across the company, and some of those tough decisions that had to be made to get the company in a place where, if I want to say, we had 370 at our peak, and I think your guys are like 220 or 230 now. So talk about that whole transformation.
Yeah, it was definitely walking into a very complex situation, I will say. One of the first things I said, I think in my first couple of weeks to Austin, which I'd been working, with Austin and the team for a couple of months before I officially joined, was like, sat down, was like, you're structured like a multi-billion-dollar media conglomerate, but that's not what the company is. And I think the reason it had gotten to that is, as you were saying, Morning Brew had existed for a few years in an advertising environment where advertisers were just running cash in hand to try to buy whatever Morning Brew could sell them. And so what that led to was increased rates, of course, but also launching new products that were primarily meant to be receptacles for revenue. Mm-hmm. Not to say that they were like necessarily poor content products, but definitely to say that that was not the point of launching them. That the point of launching them was to capture more advertising dollars. Because of that, there was also a very quick, and it is hard when you expand very quickly to also expand in a way that is going to be like foundationally strong. And so a lot of what had been built structurally and organizationally was what a lot of media companies do when they're trying to expand and grow, which is you create a lot of middle management, you create a lot of infrastructure that maybe the different pieces aren't talking to them, correctly. It's hard to hire A+ people in every position when you're hiring hundreds of people in a relatively short amount of time. So all of those dynamics were at play. I do think, in the unfortunate 2 rounds of layoff that we had, tried to be as forward thinking in that as possible, of knowing that the organization had to be smaller and thinking about how do we, take this as an opportunity to be able to do it in a way that actually is going to set up our ability to build back when we have the ability to do that in a way that's going to feel cleaner. So that was, I think, a big part of it. Another big part of it is that, as I was saying before, the reality is that people, in certain iterations of Morning Brew are going to work really well in those roles. And, as the company changes, as the strategy changes very significantly, sometimes people are not going to fit in those roles either. And so being able to figure that out both in a kind of macro way, but also in a more micro way was also pretty important. So
we had your boss, partner, whatever you want to call Robert, at the AMO Summit. And he said that you guys in 2025, we're going to finish the year at a little under $80 million in revenue, or south, I think was his exact word. Where did you guys finish the year?
South of $80 million of revenue.
Okay.
Slightly above what our plan at the beginning of last year had been.
And where were you? Are you guys profitable?
Yeah.
How are your margins?
I'm not going to talk about margins specifically, but we are profitable. We did come in a little bit over what our budget and goal had been.
And so how is 26 looking for you? I know you're not going to tell me your numbers, but how, strong 25, growth is up. How is 26 looking both for Morning Brew, but as you're looking at the advertising landscape more holistically, like how are things looking?
Yeah, so January always, is a month that feels a little bit more slippery, regardless of the traction that you've had going into the end of the year. We had a very, very good end of last year. And then as expected, January is people had, the last couple of weeks off, or if they weren't actually off, they were pragmatically off. And so, we're coming back and tackling that. I don't see anything right now that indicates any sort of trouble in the overall advertising market, but you do have to look at, the stock market and the macroeconomic environment. And, as much as I hate to say like AI is causing a lot of chaos, AI is causing a lot of chaos in terms of just like what companies are going down 20% because Claude has decided it's doing legal review, today, and they weren't doing that yesterday. And so with all of that stuff, I think the kind of day-to-day of, January into this year, feeling pretty good. But at the same time, I think we have to also keep our eyes on the medium-term horizon in a way that has, more uncertainty, I think, than normal, just because industries are getting kind of surprise disrupted. And sometimes that surprise disruption actually ends up not panning out to be anything of note, but sometimes it does. And so I think there's nothing that I've seen so far this year that is a great gauge of what the rest of the year is going to look like, but I also don't see any glaring warning signs.
No more geopolitical chaos like Liberation Day that so many other folks complained about.
Don't think I can predict that.
All right. So I'm curious about multimedia, because when I was at Morning Brew, and I've never told this story publicly, I remember Austin, Matt was the former chief operating officer. We got into a conference room and we were talking about like things starting to change a little bit. Things were not quite where we wanted them to be from a revenue and growth perspective. And I said to Austin in one of these really not like self-protection sort of ways, if you want my advice, give up on multimedia, give up on education, give up on commerce, give up on all of it, except for the daily newsletter and the B2B business. You don't need half the company. You don't need me. You don't need all this infrastructure. He didn't take that advice. It has since proven that my advice was wrong. I was operating with a different timeline in mind than perhaps now everyone else is. Now multimedia is working. Is multimedia contributing to the margin of Morning Brew, or is it still in investment mode?
Both. And that is because we have certain properties that are profitable and very profitable, and we have certain properties that are break even and some that are unprofitable and in investment stage. And I'm sure we're going to have some that, we invest in and then decide that it's not going to be worth it long term. What I will say is that Morning Brew Daily, the podcast, which is a podcast, but it's also a podcast show. We also do branded video out of that and a bunch of other stuff, is very nicely profitable. It is 7 figures profitable. It is contributing very well. And, that's probably our number one multimedia product, individual product, as of right now. But there's other ones that, are on the right path and are contributing, but it kind of depends on how you look at it. There's the direct allocation of costs, which like how much are we actually cash out the door in order to produce it? And then there's the allocated view that we look at as well as like, well, we're paying for rent and electricity and, sales commissions, all that sort of stuff. And so different views will say different things. What I will say is that from a revenue growth perspective, across the board, it has been very nicely incremental. And it also is something that there is the directly tangible, this franchise is making this amount of money. One of the other things, I talk a lot about, which is you can't directly, it's not as tangible, you can't directly measure it, is we have Good Work with Dan Toomey, a very beloved, comedy business information show. I guarantee you that helps sell Marketing Brew ads. Exactly how, I can't tell you one-to-one. I can tell you that it has come up in like sales meetings and that sort of stuff from time to time, but I can't tell you exactly what that is. But I can say absolutely by having franchises that are, have strong cultural cachet and are franchises that buyers who are just thinking about Morning Brew Inc. in general know, it is a completely different conversation if they are a fan of any of our brands. If they're not, that doesn't mean we can't sell to people who aren't fans of our brands, but there absolutely is that warming of those conversations. And so that has been another area that we've seen, one of the things I talk about with multimedia and what we've done over the past few years is that there was I think pretty well-known era of Morning Brew where it was just the coolest, hottest, like on Twitter, commodity, like that drove a lot of ad sales, right? People like, that is a really cool thing that's going on.
People used to get tattoos.
People used to get tattoos. Now we changed the logo and I'm so sorry. You have to get the tattoo redone.
Monstrous.
But like there was a very strong cultural moment for Morning Brew. When I first got to Morning Brew, I think that had passed a little bit. It doesn't mean that it had like fallen off completely, but like that moment had certainly passed and Morning Brew was operating, but it didn't have that same, I think, parasocial relationship that at a certain point it did. Building into this new strategy of multimedia and creators and social has brought that back in a lot of ways. So, Macy Gilliam, Dan Toomey, Phil on Maxonomics, are Morning Brew main creators. Like people know who they are. Like people are like, oh, I love Meg, I love Annie. And so as we're building that out, that level of connection that had again kind of like been on the fading path has blown back up in a different way than it was before, but has blown back up so that Morning Brew and our franchises have gotten back to that point where there's like true fandoms. And so again, like you can't exactly say one-to-one. So this is all talking about, like the profitability, I know, but like that is also a value that directly impacts overall company profitability. That's just a very hard thing to measure.
I mean, we launched Marketing Brew. I mean, it was before I joined, but because they wanted to get into the CMO's inboxes because they'd hoped that it would sell ads. It just happened to turn into, I don't know what it generates now, but I was there. It was close like to 8-9 million in revenue. Not bad for a marketing tool.
Yep.
All right, so over 80 million in revenue this year. That's obviously not like the long-term goal. That's not what I'm sure keeps leadership around. There's a longer-term vision. So let's crack that 100 million number. How do you get there? Is it purely organic? Is it purely just the shows you've got right now and the newsletters you've got right now and the brands you've got right now? Or is there a bigger swing that has to come? Is there a new division that has to be launched? How do you get to 100 million and then beyond?
The way that we plan for it is we are mostly planning for organic growth or organic launches, basically. And so we have a path to be able to get to that point that does not include acquisitions or inorganic growth. That said, we've always been open, like we would always be opportunistic about M&A that made sense. And, we're not reliant on that, but that's absolutely not off the table. And that could look like a, creator brand. It could look like a media brand. It could look like a lot of different things. My point of view on M&A that you bring into, Morning Brew Inc. is that a lot of the value of Morning Brew Inc. comes from, as I was talking a little bit about intangibles, is that it is an asset that it has a lot of, culture, has a lot of, call it vibes, I guess. But if you want to bring in a creator or a media brand, like it really has to be a great fit that is going to be additive to the entire universe of Morning Brew brands. It is pretty easy to go look at something and say, that is a compelling business, but it's not going to be something that is accretive specifically to bring them into our universe because it's just not how, the Morning Brew Inc. universe operates. And that's totally fine. And the larger an acquisition gets, the more of a concern, if you want to call it that ends up being. Because if it's bigger, it's more established in how it operates and it's less able to be kind of molded into a Morning Brew way of operating. But there absolutely are things that are out there that would fit very nicely within Morning Brew. And there are creators, like a great example is Phil in Maxonomics. We found him as he was kind of hanging up his cleats on making content. He had day jobs and he was having a lot of success in that. He had started his TikTok channel. The content quality was good, but it wasn't like taking off to the point of being able to have a sustainable business. And so we were able to bring him in. Maxonomics crushing it. He's doing an incredible job. And now that he has, his job to focus on content, has been able to grow really well. And so there's also that sort of, light acqui-hire M&A that we could look at as well. And so all of that is to say, our options are open, but we're not planning for needing, a specific size M&A in order to hit those goals.
All right. So that was an acqui-hire. You brought him in. You said, we're going to give you a salary. So this can be your job, make a lot of content that's now growing. So that's an acqui-hire for growth. Acquisitions, those are risky. Those come with their own things. But even organically, how are you identifying when something can become a show, right? Like if you just said tomorrow you want to launch a show about sports, your favorite topic, right? Like how would you do that in an organic way without having to go out and either buy talent or hire expensive? Like, well, how does that work?
So it can work a variety of ways. One of the things that I often like to say is that my F word is format, which formats are fine, but the instinct that people often have to define what the format of a show is going to be before testing and seeing if it's actually going to be successful is, I think, a folly that a lot of people fall into. They see, Chicken Shop Date, or they see Hot Wings interview show,
or two guys sitting at a table talking about media.
Yeah. Exactly right. Yes, the trifecta. Yeah. And then they're like, oh, so a format is what drove the success of those shows. And it's not, right? It's like those formats absolutely are very successful, but why? Well, the interviews are great, the personalities are great, and that format adds to all of that. And so one of the ways that we've done this is we had Macy Gilliam, who when I got there was like an associate social media associate. And, she over a few years became a personality on our social content. And, that was sketch videos at first. It was, on location style videos. And then over time, she was having a lot of success creating content. And as she was having a lot of success, she also was finding the type of thing that she wanted to do more of. And so we have Out There with Macy now, which is her own show, but that came because she started experimenting with, she went to a rubber stamp shop and just talked with that business owner. And it was a really great video. She went and, talked to the guy who sells, tons of hot dogs at Central Park. And so what we realized is that there was something there that was a match of what her interests and passions are, and the Morning Brew brand, and was something specific enough that we were able to launch. And so that could be the route for, sports, of if we had someone in the Morning Brew universe and they were Morning Brew talent and, their passions lied in the business of sports area. And, it wouldn't be that they were allowed to only do that at all ever at first. But if they started doing that content and it started picking up and people really liked it and responded to it, that would be a good indication that we'd be able to build a creator-fronted franchise around the business of sports. That's one way you could do it. Brew Markets is an example of, I have 4 circles of a Venn diagram of the genres within which we will play. And one of those is markets and investing. And Morning Brew is not a markets and investing brand. It is a business and business news brand. We cover markets as it applies to that, but we don't go super deep, and that's intentional. But out of the many millions of people who like Morning Brew, a very solid percentage of those also would like Morning Brew's approach to covering markets. And so that one was, I know I want to get more weight in markets and investing. That's actually the same time that we brought in Phil and Maxonomics. And so we launched a brand specifically meant to be able to do that. And that was kind of built with the intention of building it. So we have a variety of ways that we could tackle wanting to get into new genres.
But theoretically, you're not going to wake up tomorrow and say, we're launching a show about X. You're going to wake up tomorrow and hire someone to start creating content and see just what kind of content they create. And that then leads to a show.
Yes, on the first path I was talking about, but Brew Markets again was the other one where I said I wanted an investing brand,
and so then we went out and found people who were already creating. Is that like?
So we launched it as a newsletter first.
Okay.
So we launched Brew Markets as a newsletter first, and then we did bring in talent to launch the podcast and do social video after that.
What makes a good creator a good creator?
That's a big question. It also, creator is a term that I think is used a little bit too broadly. Okay. Also. I'm not saying you are, but it also oftentimes like people use that to mean like video producer or on-screen talent. The way that I think about creator is it is someone who is making content who has a hand in like the total creation of that content. So not, someone who just sits in front of camera and talks, not someone who just films, not someone who just edits. They will probably get help from a wide variety of people, but it's someone who, they don't have to do every part of the process, but writes or does a lot of the writing, is on camera or is mostly on camera, has an idea of the story that they want to tell. It's like kind of that, not exactly one-man band, but like a kind of holistic view of the content that they want to create. And the reality is that there are plenty of skills that can be taught to be able to make that the best, but there's also an intrinsic, nature to people who are going to be able to come across in an authentic way. And I mean, that's where you see creators do really well. I think that's also, to jump to another point that you didn't ask me about, I think that's also a trap that a lot of media companies fall into, is that they see creators are making content and audiences like that. And then so they're like, all right, well then now I'm going to make this person who's not a creator do creator-like things. And well, why is that not engaging? Why is that not breaking through? Why is this short form content that I'm making my staff member create not engaging in the way that, other things are? Because there is that, to an extent, je ne sais quoi, but really it is just like the ability to be personable and engaging on camera that is not something everyone can do.
All right, so I have other people who are editing this show. Does that mean I am no longer a creator?
Not necessarily, but I'm sure you have a vision for how you want it to come out, and you probably give some notes. But no, being able to, offload parts of the process, I would not say doesn't make you a creator. I also think that, the creator route oftentimes are that now there are creator companies where the creator who used to film, edit, write, and do the entire thing are more so on the talent side of things. So it's more, I think, the vision and ability to pull things together versus like you literally have to pull every lever.
So what is the Morning Brew pitch to talent or creators that are already doing this? Like, when you sit down with one of these folks, what are you saying that gets them across the finish line to bring their experience to you guys?
Like an established creator that I'd want to bring in-house?
Established creator, or really, I mean, I suspect maybe you answer it differently. Would you hire someone in a content role who had never created content?
Never created content, probably not. Had not built an established audience, for sure. And so I guess that's part of it, is that one of the draws to what we do is that I am looking for people who don't want to be a cookie cutter producer, which is not a slight on people who want to do that. But our style and approach is very different. Like if you take our sister company, Business Insider, and you look at what they do on YouTube, they are very format driven. They are very much like, these are Business Insider videos, and then we assign producers to them, and what comes back is a Business Insider video. We are very much on the side of, if you get a Shreyas video, it feels like a Shreyas video. If you get a Macy video, it feels like a Macy video. If you get a James video, it feels like a James video. And so for creators and video producers who want to be able to, like, I need them to make Morning Brew content, right? They can't just go do any old thing, but I also want the stamp of their personality and their approach in it, which is kind of a more creator focused way. And so if I'm having a conversation with someone who's interested in getting to the start of that path, we are one of the most compelling places that you can do that.
And then for an established creator, what is the pitch?
The first thing I say in conversations with established creators is that this may not be the right place for you because we have a structure that we set up, and we have, a process that we follow, and we have the setup that we have, and that works really well for some people. It doesn't work for everyone, and that's totally okay. But the reason I say that is because, we as Morning Brew, I don't want to be a network. I don't want to be a rep firm. I don't want to be a universe of like tangentially linked creators and brands that we go try to sell ads on. We kind of do some marketing for, but there's not really that link back to Morning Brew. And that was an intentional choice. We could have gone a different route. But what I do want is fewer, stronger brands that we are creating that all are very much linked to each other and the larger mission of Morning Brew Inc. overall. And so that's not going to be a fit for everyone. And we also, we take majority economics, but we have, very good uncapped splits that the creators will get in success and revenue. And also, there's no costs. So like we take the risk. We also, take the majority economics, but there's a very nice upside potential to it as well. And so that works for a lot of creators. That works for a lot of people. One of the things that I really like about the model is it works particularly well for very creative and very strong creative talent who, for one reason or another in their lives, can't just take the leap and not have a job and try to make YouTube work. It's a grind to go from zero to having an audience, and not everyone can do that for a lot of reasons. And so being able to find people like that who need a job, but also not then trap them into an ecosystem where because of that they don't participate in the upside of the value they create is something that I think we've done a very good job of, and something that overall I want more media to adopt.
So you share in the upside when a show or a creator's content is being monetized. I interviewed an operator years ago, and he said there's a balance between obviously offering upside, but not tying it so directly to the success of their product because that creator doesn't actually have say over how things get sold. I remember when I was at CoinDesk years ago, we had a podcast that we brought in, and every time there was an unsold ad, that creator was calling up our head of sales, complaining that there was an unsold ad over and over. Like, how do you balance that where like their direct compensation is tied to the success of monetization that they have no control over?
Their variable upside compensation is tied to that, but they're also de-risked. It's not like they don't get paid if the ads don't sell. There is in almost all or all of our contracts, there's a minimum guarantee piece of it where they're going to be okay. And then we're going to not actually recoup, but there's going to be a hurdle at which point then variable kicks in. And so again, we're taking risk at the very beginning stages. They're taking a little bit of risk in the very middle piece of it. And then it's the uncapped upside after we've, hit that level of profitability.
All right. So we're recording this on February 5th. Hopefully we'll get it out in the next couple of weeks. A couple weeks ago, one of Morning Brew's first creators, we before you even joined, was Money with Katie. Great personal finance show. Katie, I remember when she joined, great talent. She really cared about this topic and all that. We bought, as far as I know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, we bought her IP. We owned it. She joined full time. And the idea was to scale that up into a more robust operation. And for all intents and purposes, it worked. It made a lot more money. But I don't know if it ever reached the scale in which we all thought it might have. What is your perception of that? Because you obviously sat much closer than I did. What worked and what didn't work with the Money with Katie show?
So I don't know that things didn't work. That's not how I would necessarily describe it. Katie did an episode of her podcast, Diabolical Lies, which I suggest people check out. It's good. Where she talked a lot about, her view on all of this. And, what she talks about in that is that from joining Morning Brew and kind of from having a shared vision, this was before my time, but a shared vision for, Money with Katie can become the next massive personal finance franchise, to where she was, like in terms of what she wanted out of, her career, her life, her, what she wanted to focus on over the next couple of years and then into the last couple of years, changed pretty significantly. So it was, it made a bunch of money. It was profitable. It was doing well. But also, during that time frame, I think her desire to become the next massive personal finance creator versus other things that she wanted to focus on shifted. And so, I guess it would have been a little over a year ago now, we started having conversations because the initial 3-year contract was up, and we were just pretty candid and open with each other about, what does everyone want? What would success look like? And in my, view of doing things like this, you always want to be in a situation where those things really align. And if there is, disalignment there, you got to dive into that and you got to tackle it. What I will say is, what we got to was that those things were not totally aligned with what, Morning Brew Inc. would want out of a brand and what she wants to be doing. That's also okay, and I think that's why in those conversations, we both, rolled up our sleeves and did a lot of work. It's like, all right, well, if we know this to be the case, how are we going to build a bridge and a path that, gets the best possible result for everyone?
And so we, at the time, Morning Brew owned the IP. I say we, it's been 2 years. Morning Brew owned the IP, or Morning Brew Inc. owned the IP. But now Katie owns the IP again. Money with Katie without Katie doesn't exist. Like, you're not going to find another Katie, very unlikely, to slot into that. And so how did you all think about valuing IP when there was this weird leverage point where the IP was tied to an individual?
I tend to try to avoid the thought of leverage in these conversations as much as possible. Not to say that it's not a dynamic, obviously, but yes, there were pieces of the Money with Katie IP that would be valuable without Katie, and there were plenty of
the
totally
audience,
the lists, all that sort of stuff. And there's a lot of the value of Money with Katie that is not valuable without Katie, right? Like, it is a brand that was built around people really liking Katie. And so again, like the conversation and the approach was understanding the dynamics of, yes, Morning Brew had bought the IP and owned outright the Money with Katie IP, but it wasn't something that it seemed like Katie wanted to be doing in that way for the next several years. It really just came down to, okay, so we understand those two things to be true. It's not going to be a super easy, path that we can find, but there's almost always a solution when people tackle these things in good faith, to figure out what a path could be. And so can't dive into the exact contract dynamics, but again, we rolled up our sleeves and we did a lot of work, and we found a path that was going to work for both Morning Brew and Katie, that everyone could feel really good about, that reverted the IP over the course of years to Katie.
But as you think about valuing it, is it a function of how much profit it made for you over a period of time? Like you went from having a property to not having a property. That becomes a hole that has to be filled if you're going to continue growing revenue. So how did you determine, without telling me the number, like how did you determine that it was worth X? And she bought it faster than expected. I mean, she wrote an article about it, and I think within the first year she was done paying you guys off. So how did you come to that number?
Again, I won't go into it. I would say that's probably not the exact dynamic of the agreement. But again, it was a situation that did not cause any undue financial strain for either side. And it was not easy to find exactly what that path was going to be. It took a bunch of work, but my opinion is that it is absolutely worth that sort of work if you want to be in the business of working with creators and creator talent. Now, that doesn't mean that is the way that every single one of these situations is going to go. There's plenty of IP and there's plenty of brands that we're going to create that may have a creator attached to it, and if they want to leave at some point, you could replace them, right? There are some things that are not going to be as intrinsically linked, and that's okay as well. But then working as a media organization and wanting to really do creator right, it's a complex thing, because every situation, every relationship is going to be different. Everyone has their very different goals for themselves. If you ask Macy or Dan Toomey or Phil or any of our creators on Morning Brew, like what their long-term aspirations are, what their paths are, no one is going to have the exact same answer. And so to be a media company that wants to be in the space, you have to be structured and able to work with really strong creative talent that is driving your business goals forward, but also know that you need to be driving their aspirations forward at the same time. You have to be able to work with them in different ways for each individual person and brand. Otherwise, what value are you providing? How are you going to keep them around for as long as possible? I get asked very often of aren't you scared that creators are going to leave? I'm like, no, of course they are at some point. My goal is to keep them with us for as long as possible. I think one of the biggest shoot yourself in the foot things that we've seen is when the previous era of digital media had video producers creating 7-figure IP valuations, and then the reward was 10% raise and a pat on the back, right? But if you build structures that are going to maximize the time where everyone is moving in the right direction, I also have to bet on myself as an operator to be able to build a pipeline and an infrastructure and to be able to bring in more people to fill any holes. And, in the case of Katie and other things, that if and as people leave, it's done in a way that everyone can feel good about. And so where it gets challenging is again, every situation is going to be very different depending on all the context. And so it has to be tackled as, unique conversations with unique situations. There's not a cookie cutter approach to it.
Doesn't that inherently make it hard to scale though? Like with the B2B business that I built, it was very easy to launch another vertical, right? I knew I was looking for an editor, looking for a couple reporters. We'd go from 2 days to 3 days, hired a third reporter. We'd go from 3 to 5 if it was crushing it. It was very scalable. You're talking about every creator is special, which sure they are. How do you scale that?
It is a far more complex proposition, but it's also one that, for those reasons, it's hard to get right. And if you can get it right, that is a huge competitive advantage.
And so is that why most media companies have failed when it comes to creators?
It's one of the reasons.
What are the other reasons?
I think if you don't really understand the platforms and the creator economy, you don't really know how to get into creator content. It goes back to one of the things I was saying before, which is that, pivot to video was pivot to bad video, right? Mm-hmm. Because you had organizations that just saw video makes more money, didn't really put together good video makes more money. Bad video still doesn't get seen by anyone. And so it's a similar dynamic of you look at people like creators, but if you don't know what that actually means, everything that goes into why do people like creators? And no, they don't. They like people. They like content. They're not really thinking about I love creators. That's not the way that audiences think. You can try to build something that looks like a cardboard cutout of a creator business. And from a distance, you're like, oh, maybe that's a creator business. But then if you get up close, you're like, it's actually not at all. And so there's a lot that goes into it. I think the complexity of managing that well. I think there's also generally speaking, across the media industry and industries in general, there tends to be an instinct towards leverage, towards like trapping or like keeping people in your ecosystem and maximizing and extracting as much value as you can. Don't get me wrong. I want to create a ton of value for Morning Brew Inc. and our overall ecosystem, but I also want to do that with a long-term view that also maximizes the value that the creators get out of it. And so, as I was saying before, we're going to take majority economics. We're going to build a really valuable business for Morning Brew, but at the same time, I don't want to take the approach of then trying to squeeze every penny out of these arrangements, because longer term, we're all going to make way more money if that's not the approach.
So you come from Cheddar, which was a daily business show. You then launched a daily business show at Morning Brew. It was your first thing. Oh, one of the very first things you did. Was that because that was the right thing to do for Morning Brew at the time, or was that because you wanted a slam dunk win and you knew exactly how to do it?
Morning Brew Daily is very different than what Cheddar was. Okay. So I'd say there's not a whole lot of overlap between those two products. The infrastructure that we have and like the studios and the control rooms, like there's similarities there, but that's kind of where it stops. Morning Brew Daily there was a lot of conversations. I was talking a bunch with Austin about it. I feel and felt very strongly that a medium is never too saturated for bad stuff that people don't want. Sure. But there's like a whole, you can't launch podcasts. Like it's just, there's too many of those, people don't want it. And my thought is like, no, if you get something right and it's something that is going to be able to break through the noise, it doesn't really matter how many total other shows there are. And so that was one that to me felt very nicely adjacent in a way that a lot of the other multimedia content that the company was making did not feel adjacent. So as I was saying before, I didn't want Morning Brew Daily to just be, Neil and Toby or whoever read the newsletter. I want it to be its own distinct thing. Obviously, there's going to be some overlap. But at the same time, I did want it to feel like you could osmosis over and really understand what was going on. One of the challenges that I think the show Business Casual had was that it was sort of related, but you kind of had to make a few jumps from what Morning Brew was doing really well to what Business Casual was. And so like building out from a really strong core with things that are not identical, but just like make for easy bridges for audiences, I think is a really important way of doing it, because you're building out from your strength. You're not just like creating a lot of islands. And so that was the Morning Brew Daily approach. I would say that I think I can honestly say that like the Cheddar experience did not play into Morning Brew Daily almost at all.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that it's successful. It's making money. I think that's the real thing. I always found it interesting that the very first thing that the guy from Cheddar did was launch a business show.
Fair.
So, I just finally got to say it out loud. All right, let's go back to why everyone loved Morning Brew to begin with, and that was the daily newsletter. That is the thing. When most people hear Morning Brew, probably even to this day, is still the thing most people know it for, although increasingly it is Neil and Toby, and it is increasingly Neil and Toby. How does the daily newsletter fit into the ecosystem of Morning Brew now? It is a very solid foundation. It is a mature product. We expect it to grow, but we don't expect it to grow, super rapidly. And it is, it makes a lot of our revenue. Our goal is for it to make less of a percentage of our revenue while still contributing higher dollar amounts over the next few years. It's also, I think a really solid asset for just building, maintaining, and having those relationships with audiences. So when we launch new things, that is a great place to tell people about. So the newsletter itself remains just like the keystone of the business, but with a goal that it becomes less and less of a contributor to the total pie of revenue. But still accounts for probably 40 to 50% of the company. Is that true?
Ish.
And how do you see that, if that's going to continue to grow, how do you see the other parts of the business having to grow faster to get there?
They are. And so that's the trajectory
that's
that we're
happening.
On. Yeah, that's absolutely happening. And, we have plenty of fun charts and graphs of, what we have expected versus what's happening. And they're pretty aligned. Obviously, we need to continue executing on that. But that is the, stated and unambiguous goal, is that we want the newsletter, the daily newsletter, to remain rock solid and really strong, but we want the other businesses to, in totality, overtake it more and more as we go in terms of what the percentage of contribution is.
Could the creator business have reached the point it is today without the daily newsletter?
Two answers to that, I think, are no, because it has provided so much of the revenue and ability to invest into things.
Let's say I gave you a pot of gold. Let's say I invested the amount of money that the daily newsletter was going to make that you could then invest in the creator business. But so the resources aren't the thing. Could it have made that?
So one of the big changes that I made when I came in is that what had been launched in multimedia was very dependent on newsletter promotion to get any eyeballs on it at all.
Everything at Morning Brew was dependent on daily promotion.
Everything at Morning Brew is very dependent on, it's to the point where it was like the newsletter had kind of become a barker for just like other products that we, wanted people to go check out without, I think, doing enough thought is this what the audience actually wants to go be checking out? And so Morning Brew Daily, in the 3+ years that has existed, 3 years, has been promoted in the newsletter 5 times, maybe less. I don't know exactly, but that's very intentional. Where yes, we used it to promote, but I was never going to allow it to be dependent like a lot of the other products had been. It has to exist in its own medium, and it has to exist in a way where it's going to compound its own growth to be a strong standalone product. And so using strategic promotion in the newsletter is an unfair advantage that we have, and we're absolutely going to do that. But there is a tendency to move from strategic promotion into crutch promotion. And that is something that we have to be very intentional, that we do not allow any crutch promotion if we can't build multimedia products that exist and grow outside of that. The newsletter is an amazing catalyst, but it cannot be something that anything is dependent on long-term. And so my answer is that yes, we probably could have built all of these things without the newsletter, but it is an unfair advantage and we can accelerate it because we have the newsletter.
In 2026, do you think anybody could ever launch a Morning Brew from scratch and build that newsletter today?
No.
Why?
I think that Morning Brew existed and grew and compounded in an era where that sort of snowballing growth in the newsletter world was possible in a way that it is not possible now. Part of that is because there's massive competition and a huge niche down in terms of the newsletters that are available, which has opened up a ton of opportunity for smaller and independent operators. But it has, I think, also kind of taken away a lot of opportunity from the very high scale. You can build a multi-100 person business around newsletter specifically. I think that newsletter can absolutely be a very strong piece of a larger business, but I don't think that there is a Morning Brew story that can happen in that way again. And part of that is also advertising market dynamics. Is that we were talking about earlier is like Morning Brew was so sexy, newsletter was so sexy. You couldn't take dollars as many as people were willing to give you. That's also just something that is not going to be the same dynamic either.
I recognize wholeheartedly that open rates are a really bad metric because they're not trustworthy. But what is the daily newsletter's open rate?
Around 50%.
So it stayed pretty solid. I mean, I think that's what it was when I was there as well.
Yeah, and our growth team does a really good job of we're active churners. We're very much quality readers, and so we will remove people who we don't think are active or getting value out of the newsletter, and so we do pay a lot of attention to those health metrics.
I'm glad that you mentioned the growth team because it's a fundamentally wonderful growth team when it comes to growing newsletters. But growing a newsletter is different than multimedia growth. And I remember there was a lot of tension between growing multimedia, growing newsletters. These people have expertise in one thing, but maybe not the other. How do you think about audience development between those two mediums? Is it different teams? Is it actually not that different at all? Like, talk about that.
It is very different. But as a unified team now. So we have moved, we used to have like different pockets of audience development. All of our audience development and audience growth rolls into Christine, who leads the growth team. They are, I think, functions that take different skill sets, take different mindsets, but it is very valuable for that to be a unified thing. The reason that it wasn't unified was, as we were talking about before, in terms of just like overall organizational structure and some of the challenges that existed there, it couldn't happen in a unified way before, but with a, healthier structure for the overall company, it can. And so doing paid media acquisition for a newsletter and then working on content strategy for a YouTube channel, extraordinarily different things. And you will need different people and different skill sets, but also people who are smart and good at one thing can learn elements of the other as well. And so part of the idea behind combining all of that is that people can get stronger with experts in other areas and can learn, other elements of different parts of growth of the overall media properties that we have. So it ends up working out.
made it about an hour before I brought up the professional division in any sort of way. A name that unfortunately you gave it, which I fought resistantly against.
I don't know if that's true.
I'm pretty sure it's true. Yeah, it's true. How has that part of the business grown within the portfolio? Because it was in many respects a cookie cutter play, right? Like, when I joined, the idea was very clearly, let's do what Industry Dive had done. Let's just do that, but with the backing of a daily newsletter that we could just pump a ton of subscribers in, and it grew monumentally. How has that division been handled, been growing over the past number of years, and where is the future for that?
So it is more cookie cutter than the consumer division for sure. But one of the things that we have been working on over, the past, call it, year, has been taking, some of the strong strengths that we have in our consumer portfolio and moving those into the professional portfolio, and vice versa, taking strengths that we have in the professional portfolio and then applying those where it makes sense in the consumer portfolio. And so some of that, what that has looked like is we have launched, podcast shows and multimedia now within the professional division, which was something that for a while was like, if it was multimedia, it was in the consumer division, which, was not intentional, but it was what it was. And so Robert, our CEO, has a visual that I like, where it's one cube becoming multiple cubes, becoming a Rubik's cube of kind of building out on the foundational strength of the brands and then adding more around that. And so, in my view of the professional brands, I think there is a lot of opportunity. Like, we do events, of course. Now we're doing multimedia with them. We have the newsletter and publications. We can continue to add to those in a way that I think will still feel a little bit more, cookie cutter and structured than perhaps you're going to get on some of the consumer brands, but also allows those brands to exist as similar to Morning Brew, as brands that express themselves across a lot of different mediums instead of newsletters that have some other components to them.
So one of the reasons I ultimately left Morning Brew, and beyond the fact that AMO was successful, was it started to get a little complicated building a B2B business within a consumer media business, because the ambitions were for it to always be a consumer media business. That was always the instinct I had. Some of the executive decisions, very consumer oriented. What have been the challenges, and have you overcome any of those challenges in getting a media company that still saw itself as primarily a consumer media business to sell more B2B?
B2B, I would say, is probably where sales is flowing the smoothest right now, I would say. There's a variety of reasons for that. I think, there are not a lot of success stories for combining a consumer portfolio of brands and a B2B portfolio of brands.
Very, very few.
Very few. And I think one of the things that we have done well is that any seller can sell any property, but obviously are going to, lean in more where it makes sense for what their book of business is. But there's plenty of B2B advertisers who want to advertise in our consumer portfolio because our consumer portfolio is business focused and, other reasons. But I think that is something where it is absolutely a challenge because they don't operate the same way. A good example of this, where launching multimedia, we have an extremely strong now multimedia strategy in consumer. And one of the things that, I had to spend a lot of time on, and the teams that are working with that have to spend a lot of time on, is that success in B2B audience looks very different than success in B2C audiences. So if we launched a Marketing Brew show, for example, and it blew up and 10% of the audience was marketers, that wouldn't be good. It'd
be horrible.
Yeah, that would just not work for the strategy. And so the audience strategies are different. The business strategies are different. There are a lot of benefits, though. Like, one of the biggest benefits is that the vast majority of B2B audience has funneled through the consumer division. I don't see that really changing anytime in the foreseeable future. And you can do that by building out, relationships with people who have jobs, but they're attaching themselves to you because of a very high affinity consumer brand. And then they come over to, a professional brand that's going to make them better at their job. There's a ton of value there in getting it right. But, as you were asking about some of the monetization challenges, it is, a complex ask for, revenue teams and operations teams to be able to basically simultaneously operate in a unified way against two different product strategies.
And so you had said before that Morning Brew was built a little bit like a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. And it was, right? Like, we had a head of B2B, we had a head of consumer, we had, at that time we had a head of education and head of commerce, and I'm sure we had another head that I'm not thinking about. And then you guys have now gotten rid of all that. But isn't the inverse of getting rid of all that conglomerate strategy actually allows each division to truly stand on its own? Like, couldn't B2B have grown faster had it had its own sales team that knew how to sell that specifically? Like, are there trade-offs on anyone can sell everything versus specialists selling their specialty?
Totally. There absolutely are trade-offs. And that's why we brought in a video and creator focused seller, is that again, we've made great progress in terms of our sales team being able to sell our creator and video products. But we want to accelerate that. And we looked at it and was like, well, we're going to be able to accelerate this by bringing in specific expertise onto the sales team. So we're absolutely not opposed to that, but you do have to pick one or the other. Mm-hmm. Maybe you don't, but like, if you're not going to really hire, massively, you kind of have to pick one lane or the other. And I think both are legitimate potential paths. You could choose either option there and potentially have it work, but neither one is a gimme either. And so, the way that it has made sense is to have a unified sales team that is able to shoot across all of the brands. And if you look at Morning Brew Daily, a lot of the advertisers are B2B. Like, there is a lot of opportunity in having that cross-functional ability to sell that you wouldn't totally lose, but it would get a lot harder if you had, sales teams that were not able to just very easily go and get inventory from wherever the advertiser wanted. That also makes it really hard when you get to the enterprise level, because if you think about, Amazon, for example, and you're going after them, and you're talking with them, like, some of their stuff is consumer advertising, some of their stuff is business advertising, some of their stuff is somewhere in the middle, and there's other big advertisers that are like that. And you either then have to have a B2B Amazon seller or team, or a B2C Amazon seller or team, or a team that can kind of tackle that and just whichever conversation they're having, be able to then move that into the right portfolio.
So very recently, Vox Media just announced that they were basically effectively splitting the company and splitting the sales teams, really doing the exact opposite of what you guys are talking about, where they're now going to have like a brand sales team for like The Verge and Vox and what other the ones, SB Nation. And then they're going to have a podcast or multimedia specific sales team. So basically 2 people from Vox Media talking to Amazon. Are they going to struggle with that? Like, what are the disadvantages that they're going to play into now?
I mean, total speculation, but I'm assuming they're doing that to sell one of them, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's my thesis.
Yeah. So I think that it will be a challenge in doing that, but my guess is that that's probably, the goal is so that they can more easily, sell or merge or do something with the podcast group, so that they don't have the challenge of having to separate that if and as a transaction might happen.
And as an operator, perhaps as someone who has seen M&A take place in this industry, how would you, what is the tangible asset for Vox Media if they did sell that podcast multimedia side of the business?
What do you mean?
So they have all these shows, but they don't own all the IP, similar to like Morning Brew. Like, you guys own some of the IP, you take most of the economics, but like the creator leaves. Like, how do you value one of these businesses?
I think you have to value it as the network model to an extent. I think Vox has done a decent job of branding their podcast studio, both with audiences, but also with creators, as a, good and potential long-term home to be able to launch these sort of shows. So, when you're evaluating these sorts of things, you do evaluate the value based on how likely you think or how long, like the longevity of the relationships that they have, what those, profit margins on those different relationships look like. But that's going to be the case with any sort of, talent focused business. Blow it up to large scales. Like, how would you value CAA or UTA or WME based on their client list, knowing that, they could move around? You just have to look at the strength and what the momentum looks like. So I do think that, given what they've done with that business, is that I don't think it feels very brittle in terms of the relationships that they've built. And I do think that they have the, network effects of, them or, a new owner or a new merger partner, whatever they might, I think would have a solid foundation to be able to continue that.
I want to ask about where you see newsletters going. So newsletters historically were an incredible demand gen channel. You drove a ton of clicks. I mean, during the pandemic, when Morning Brew was really seeing a lot of its scale, e-commerce brands could throw an ad in the newsletter and generate a strong return on ad spend. The vast majority of clicks in the inbox are fake. They're bots, right? And we know this. It's probably 60, 70, 80% of clicks. How do you, and you could disagree, I've seen some from ESP data. How do you think about reframing the newsletter as an advertising channel when so many of those clicks are bots?
So I'd say the vast majority of clicks are, but not the vast majority of reported clicks, because you can filter out a lot of non-human interactions. And so there's always going to be a piece of that. But I do think that no one should be using clicks. If you're a performance marketer, that's a nice proxy. That's a nice, metric to be able to look at on the ancillary, but you should also be looking at what is actually happening on your website that you can track. So, conversions and that sort of stuff. If you are spending dollars in newsletter and you are tracking to the extent possible those conversions and what your actual ROI is, total click count doesn't matter too much, other than using that to be able to benchmark and then maybe to be able to use that as a proxy for evaluating other marketing opportunities. But a non-human click is not going to block a human from making a purchase. Correct. So that's something where, I think, we've had a lot of conversations about this within Morning Brew, and I've had some conversations throughout the industry, and I am not overly concerned with the non-human traffic patterns, as long as everyone's making a good faith effort to not report those in a way that inflates and then raises prices in a way that isn't going to drive value for the advertisers. But, let's say you learn from Tuesday to Wednesday that 10% of the clicks that you are measuring are actually bots. It's not like you're selling a worse product the next day if people are seeing ROI on those clicks. So you want to be very vigilant to that. And you also don't want to be making, bad product or content decisions based on clicks that are not actual audience engagement. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to, if you are tackling this stuff, again, in good faith and not trying to use bot clicks as a way to inflate your value, it's not a huge deal.
You guys recently launched a market intelligence-like product, or maybe that's not the way you would describe it. Talk a little bit about that and how you see that growing within Morning Brew.
So Morning Brew has had an advantage of first-party data and millions of email addresses, and the break room, which is thousands and thousands of opted-in survey takers and all this sort of stuff for a very long time, for many years. And we basically only used it for internal purposes of, we want to launch a product, we want to get audience feedback, we want to understand who our audience is. That's very valuable for us. But Mike Nallon, who runs the insights team, for a long time has been like, there's more that we can be doing with this. And there's more that we can be doing for our advertisers. We can use this data advantage that we have compared to a lot of other media companies that don't have that direct connection, and we can build out really interesting ways to work with them, or to make white papers that we can then use to market ourselves. And so that's something that has been sitting a little bit latent just due to bandwidth, that over the past several months to maybe a year, that team and some other teams have really just leaned forward and be like, all right, how can we use what we already have, package it, and then put an effort to make it into something that's going to be really compelling for advertisers, partners, audiences, and just use it more, basically. And so we've started to go to market with that. My point of view is it's not going to be like a massive game-changing product line for us, but it'll be a very nice, add-on to a lot of the things that we're doing. It's a great way to build more trust with advertisers. It's a great way to make content as well. So I think that's something that's going to be a very nice addition, and a very nice seamless addition to a lot of the things that we're doing.
So we've talked about scale a little bit, and one of the problems with media companies is as they start to get larger, they start to do things to reach a larger group of people. And you and I have talked a lot about this concept of the trap of generality. How has now growing to a business that's generating $80 million plus a year in revenue this year, let's assume you hit the goals. You have a dozen plus brands in the inbox. You've got multimedia shows, multiple of them now. How are you avoiding that trap of generality so that you don't lose the soul of what the brand represents?
Can you tell your editors to flash my very unscientific graphic up on screen
for
anyone who's watching? This is something I like to talk a lot about, because it's an invisible trap that hits you kind of all at once if you're not looking for it. And so, to give a little bit more context on the way that I use the phrase trap of generality, is that as a media company that starts with, you could call it niche, you could call it focus, but starts with like a specific reason to exist, grows, it becomes very tempting to use the scale that has been built in that foundation, and then try to drive quicker, easier, perhaps cheaper growth, right? And so what oftentimes happens is that media brands who, let's use Morning Brew as an example, because, when I first got here, there were elements of kind of going down that path, which is why I made the chart originally. is, you're built as a business media brand, but then you're like, wait, this politics story that we wrote popped off. People really like that. The sports story, right? Politics and sports, as you always like to chide me about launching those. Like those things, if you're not aware of the dynamic or you're not actively working against it, you look at that and then what is the logical conclusion that you're going to make? It's like, oh, our audience wants more politics and wants more sports. That is noise, not signal. What you're really seeing is that you, as a media brand with the foundational base of an audience, everyone, for the most part, is somewhat interested in politics and somewhat interested in sports. That's not why they go to your brand, but they will engage with that stuff to an extent. Like, oh, that's interesting. It's in my feed or whatever. I'll click on it. And then also people who are not interested in the core of your brand are more likely to engage with something that is going to be, resonant with them. But what you don't see is that those people, that quicker growth is people who don't actually care about you. They don't care about that core of your mission. And so your metrics go up. It looks nice. The bar charts of uniques or however you want to measure it go up. And there's not, in my chart, there's not a nice distinction between core audience and transient audience. And so it looks like it's a very healthy thing. But the core audience is falling out underneath you. They're like, well, I didn't sign up to, I don't care about this brand because they cover politics and sports and pop culture and all these other things that are more like lower common denominator type content. And so they're falling out. You don't really notice it because, again, just the foundation that you have built allows you to get in front of more people in total. And then there's a point where all of those people who actually don't care at all about you for one reason or another stop engaging with you. Maybe it's a platform shift. Maybe it's another reason, but they stop engaging with you and your core audience is also gone and you have imploded yourself because you were chasing that quicker, cheaper growth. Oftentimes that's because quicker, cheaper growth also allows you to show numbers that then make you make more money in the short term, compromising the long term. So that is something that is very important to be on guard of. And it's, on the one hand, it's very difficult to work against because the instinct is just like, if we grow and we can make more money, then, the short-term goal is going to be easier to hit. On the other hand, it's actually not that hard to know whether or not the actions that you're taking are long-term accretive or mortgaging essentially the value that you've created. That's not a very complex decision to be making. And sometimes you have to mortgage, like that. An ad business is continuously mortgaging, the audience trust that you have, but doing it in a balanced way that doesn't actually lead to a downward trajectory. But if you start taking more from that audience, then you're going to be able to spike that near-term gain because you're just taking more. But then as that happens, you're going to lose that long-term relationship. So, it comes down to ad load conversations. It comes down to what advertisers will we work with and what advertisers will we not work with. It is, when we have a creator business, it is, this brand really wants to work with, Good Work, for example. It's like, well, the last video we made was about their industry and it wasn't particularly favorable. We can't do that, right? And so it's making sure that you are as cognizant of your own internal brand safety as you are, and you should be, about your partner's external brand safety as well.
All right, we're going to wrap up. We got a couple quick questions for you. So first, what is some advice that you would give operators who are thinking about building out their own creator operation, or they want to launch a great newsletter or something like, or really anything in the media space? Like, what is some advice that you give operators to make sure they're successful?
Don't assume anything, which I think is like very vague. But at the same time, I think that where people oftentimes find a lot of challenges are they make high level or macro assumptions, and then they try to operate against that without really testing it on a smaller level. So, examples of that could be just going back to like, I want to launch creators and therefore now I'm going to make this person who's not a creator kind of look and feel like a creator. That's not going to work. And so don't assume that you're going to be able to kind of make the leap from I want to be here and I'm not there at all, and just kind of make it happen. Understand what the path is going to be, and also understand if you don't know the dynamics of the platforms that you want to engage in, either learn them or like find people who really do. And I think that's another key piece of this. Like if you want to grow in YouTube, the people who are working on the content for YouTube better watch a lot of YouTube. They better know how it works. They better use it on their TV, use it on their mobile. Like if they can navigate the ecosystem, they're going to just have a sense of what they need to make in order to make it break out in that platform. Or if you have someone who doesn't know YouTube, or they know it as like the video embed player on some websites, you're going to get that product out.
And what is something in your life, professionally, personally, right now that you are just obsessed with?
It's a good question. I don't know.
Come on, you have to have one obsession.
Can I say work?
If that's your thing, man.
Unfortunately, well, I'll change that, but probably at this moment in time, it is work and work adjacent things.
Dig it. Well, Devin, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate you. And yeah, this was fun.
Yeah, it was fun. Have me back.
Maybe.
All right.